Marcus Johnson drove slowly through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, a peaceful suburban neighborhood where he had lived for the past 3 years since retiring. The evening sun cast long shadows as his black sedan moved past well-kept lawns and family homes. At 58, Marcus carried himself with the distinct confidence of someone who had spent his life in service to others. Today had been a good day. He had visited his daughter Amara and his 2 grandchildren for Sunday dinner, something he tried to do every week. The smell of his daughter's famous pot roast still lingered on his clothes, and he smiled thinking about how 6-year-old Zion had proudly shown him his science project. Marcus checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. He planned to review some documents for the private security firm he occasionally consulted for before bed. As a retired Secret Service agent with 25 years of distinguished service, his expertise was still in high demand. In his rearview mirror, Marcus noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for the last few blocks. He mentally reviewed his driving. He wasn't speeding, his taillights worked, and his registration was current. Still, years of training had taught him to stay alert. When the cruiser's lights began flashing, a small knot formed in his stomach. Strange, Marcus thought as he properly signaled and pulled to the side of the road. He had been stopped perhaps twice in all his years of driving. Following the protocol he knew well, he turned off the engine, placed his hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, and waited. Through his side mirror, Marcus observed the police officer approach. White male, around 30, moving with an aggressive stance that seemed unnecessary for a routine traffic stop. The officer's hand rested near his holstered weapon, something Marcus's trained eye couldn't miss. License and registration, the officer demanded, without offering any greeting or explanation for the stop. His nameplate read Reynolds. "Good evening, Officer Reynolds," Marcus replied calmly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer's face hardened. "I said license and registration. Now." Marcus nodded. "I'll need to reach for my wallet. It's in my back pocket." "Just do it slowly," Officer Reynolds said, his tone unnecessarily harsh. As Marcus carefully retrieved his wallet and vehicle documents, he noticed Reynolds scanning the interior of his car, eyes narrowing at the small photo of Marcus in his Secret Service uniform that Amara had framed for him as a retirement gift. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Reynolds finally said, taking the documents. "There was a break-in reported a few blocks from here." Marcus knew there had been no such reports in this neighborhood for months. The community newsletter just yesterday had celebrated 6 months without incident. "I'm just returning from my daughter's house, officer. I live 3 streets over on Maple Drive." Officer Reynolds didn't acknowledge the response, instead studying Marcus's license with exaggerated scrutiny. "Where are you coming from again? This isn't the direct ride home from where this address says your daughter lives." Marcus felt the familiar weight of the situation, one he had personally never experienced in his professional capacity, but had seen happen to others and had discussed in countless sensitivity trainings he had both attended and later helped conduct. "I stopped at the corner store for some milk," Marcus explained, pointing to the grocery bag on his passenger seat. Reynolds's radio crackled. He stepped back slightly but kept his eyes fixed on Marcus. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. In all his years protecting presidents and foreign dignitaries, Marcus had faced dangerous situations with calm resolve. Now, sitting in his own car in his own neighborhood, he felt a different kind of danger, one his badge and training couldn't shield him from. Officer Reynolds stared at Marcus's license for what seemed like an unnecessarily long time. The silence between them grew uncomfortable as passing cars slowed down, drivers curious about the police stop in this quiet neighborhood. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds suddenly ordered, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon again. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. In his years of service, he had learned that calm communication was essential in tense situations. "Because I said so," Reynolds snapped. "Out. Now." Marcus took a deep breath and carefully opened his door. At his age, he moved deliberately, but Officer Reynolds seemed to interpret his caution as resistance. "Faster," Reynolds barked, grabbing Marcus's arm roughly as he emerged from the vehicle. "Officer, I'm complying with your instructions," Marcus said, wincing slightly at the unnecessary force. "There's no need for physical contact." Reynolds's face twisted with anger. Don't tell me how to do my job. Put your hands on the vehicle. Marcus placed his palms on the roof of his sedan, feet shoulder-width apart. The perfect stance of someone who knew proper procedure. This seemed to irritate Reynolds even more. "You've been arrested before? You sure know the position well," Reynolds commented with clear suspicion in his voice. "No, officer, I have not been arrested before. I'm actually a retired federal agent myself, Secret Service, 25 years of service," Marcus explained calmly. Reynolds laughed. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president's bodyguard, too." As Reynolds began patting him down, Marcus noticed a couple walking their dog had stopped across the street. The woman had her phone out, recording the incident. Marcus felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. Embarrassment at being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, but relief that there were witnesses. "I have identification in my wallet confirming my former position," Marcus said. "And I'd like to know the specific reason for this stop and search." "You matched a description," Reynolds repeated vaguely, continuing his aggressive pat-down. "Big black male in a dark sedan." "That's an extremely broad description that could match thousands of people," Marcus pointed out. "May I see the report about this alleged break-in?" Reynolds's face reddened. "You calling me a liar?" "No, sir. I'm simply requesting information I'm entitled to as a citizen." More neighbors had gathered now. Mrs. Wilson from next door stood on her porch with her husband, both looking concerned. Marcus had helped them install their home security system just last month. "Officer," called Mr. Wilson, "that's Marcus Johnson. He lives right down the street. He's a good man." "Stay back," Reynolds shouted at the neighbors, then turned back to Marcus. "Your friends won't help you. Put your hands behind your back." "This is unnecessary, Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, maintaining his composure even as he felt cold metal handcuffs close around his wrists. "I've committed no crime." Resisting arrest and interfering with police business, Reynolds muttered as he tightened the cuffs painfully. "I've done neither of those things," Marcus replied firmly. "And you know it." Reynolds roughly guided Marcus toward the police cruiser. More phones were out now, recording. Mrs. Wilson had moved off her porch and was approaching cautiously. "I'm calling Captain Williams about this," she called out. "This isn't right." Marcus recognized the name. Captain Williams was the precinct commander. He had met him at a community policing event last year. As Reynolds pushed him into the back seat of the patrol car, Marcus noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small Confederate flag pin on the officer's collar, partially hidden behind his badge. The sight made his stomach tighten. This situation was worse than he had initially thought. "Officer," Marcus said, making one more attempt, "in my wallet, you'll find my Secret Service credentials. I served on presidential protection details for Presidents Bush and Obama. A simple phone call will verify my identity." Reynolds slammed the door without responding. Through the window, Marcus could see his neighbors gathering, their faces showing concern and outrage. This was far from over. Ollie's cruiser, Marcus sat straight-backed despite the uncomfortable handcuffs. Through the window, he watched Officer Reynolds return to his sedan. Without a search warrant or proper cause, Reynolds began opening compartments and rifling through Marcus's belongings. "That's illegal search and seizure," Marcus muttered to himself, mentally documenting every violation for what would surely become a formal complaint. 25 years in the Secret Service had taught him to observe and remember details. Outside, the crowd of neighbors had grown. Mrs. Wilson was on her phone, gesturing animatedly. Two teenage boys had their phones raised, recording everything. Marcus felt a mix of humiliation and anger, but kept his expression neutral. Showing emotion now would only make things worse. Reynolds emerged from the sedan holding something in his hand. Marcus's retired Secret Service credentials in their leather wallet case. The officer stared at them, then glanced at the car where Marcus sat watching him. For a brief moment, doubt crossed Reynolds's face. The officer approached the cruiser and yanked open the door. "What's this supposed to be?" he demanded, waving the credentials. "Some kind of fake ID." "Those are my official retired Secret Service credentials," Marcus replied calmly. "As I mentioned earlier, I served for 25 years. Those credentials include contact numbers for verification." Reynolds's face darkened. You expect me to believe some random black guy driving through this neighborhood protected precedence? This looks like some costume shop garbage. From the growing crowd came an angry shout. He's telling the truth, officer. Marcus showed us pictures from the White House at the block party. Reynolds slammed the cruiser door and stormed back to his patrol car. Through the rearview mirror, Marcus could see him speaking into his radio, likely calling for backup or running a check on the credentials. 5 minutes later, another police car pulled up. A female officer stepped out, Sergeant Lisa Ramirez, according to her nameplate. Marcus had met her at a community policing event last summer. Recognition flickered across her face as she spotted him in the back seat. Ramirez approached Reynolds, and they spoke in hushed tones. Reynolds gestured wildly, pointing at Marcus's car and the credentials in his hand. Sergeant Ramirez's expression grew increasingly concerned as the conversation continued. Finally, she walked over to the cruiser and opened the door. "Mr. Johnson?" she asked, her voice professional but kind. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. May I ask you a few questions to clear this up?" "Of course, Sergeant Ramirez," Marcus replied. "Though I would appreciate if these handcuffs could be removed first. They're quite tight." Reynolds started to protest, but Ramirez silenced him with a look. "Officer Reynolds, please remove the cuffs while I speak with Mr. Johnson." Reluctantly, Reynolds unlocked the handcuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists, noting the red marks where the metal had dug into his skin. "Mr. Johnson, I remember you from the community safety workshop last summer," Ramirez said. "You mentioned your background then. Can you tell me about your Secret Service career?" "I served from 1995 to 2020, retiring as Deputy Special Agent in charge of the Presidential Protective Division," Marcus explained. "I was on security details for 2 presidents and numerous foreign dignitaries visiting the White House." Ramirez nodded. "The credentials look authentic, but protocol requires us to verify. May I call one of the contact numbers listed?" "Please do," Marcus agreed. As Ramirez stepped away to make the call, Reynolds hovered nearby, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing anxiety. The crowd of neighbors had continued to grow, with many recording the scene on their phones. Mrs. Wilson approached cautiously. "Marcus, are you all right? This is outrageous. My husband has already called the police chief about this." "I'm fine, Helen," Marcus assured her. "Please ask everyone to stay calm. The situation is being resolved." Reynolds paced nervously as Ramirez's phone call stretched to several minutes. Marcus could tell from her increasingly respectful tone and widening eyes that whoever she was speaking with was confirming not just his identity, but likely his distinguished service record as well. The tables were about to turn, and Officer Reynolds was beginning to realize it. Sergeant Ramirez ended her call and walked back to the patrol car with a completely different demeanor. Her previously professional attitude had transformed into one of deep respect and concern. "Mr. Johnson, I sincerely apologize for this incident," she said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I've just spoken with Deputy Director Collins at the Secret Service headquarters. He confirmed your identity and exemplary service record." Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his face draining of color as realization sank in. He had not only wrongfully detained a citizen, he had handcuffed and humiliated a highly decorated former federal agent to a protected residence. "Officer Reynolds," Sergeant Ramirez said sharply, "Mr. Johnson is free to go. Return his credentials and belongings immediately." Reynolds hesitated, then reluctantly handed the leather wallet back to Marcus. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered under his breath. "You still matched a description." Marcus accepted his credentials, carefully inspecting them to ensure they hadn't been damaged. "What description would that be exactly? Because I've yet to hear any specific details about this alleged break-in." Ramirez cut in. "There was no break-in reported in this area today, Officer Reynolds. I checked dispatch records while on the phone." The crowd of neighbors murmured loudly at this revelation. Someone called out, "This is blatant racial profiling." Reynolds's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I was responding to suspicious activity. He was driving slowly through the neighborhood." "I was looking for a parking space near my own home," Marcus said calmly, standing up straight despite the ache in his shoulders from the tight handcuffs. At 6'2", he towered over Reynolds. "Which is 3 blocks from here." Sergeant Ramirez turned to Reynolds. We'll discuss this further at the station. For now, return to your vehicle." As Reynolds skulked away, Marcus brushed off his clothes and addressed Ramirez. "I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding this incident." "Of course, Mr. Johnson. Would you prefer to do that now or tomorrow at the station?" Ramirez asked. "Tomorrow would be better. I believe I've had enough police interaction for one evening," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the anger he felt. The neighbors had formed a protective semicircle around Marcus. Mrs. Wilson approached with her husband. "We recorded everything, Marcus," she said, showing him her phone. "This is absolutely disgraceful. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Helen, thank you," Marcus assured her, though the ache in his wrists told a different story. "I appreciate everyone's concern." As Marcus walked back to his car, people patted his shoulder and offered words of support. He maintained his dignified demeanor, but inside, a storm of emotions battled for dominance: humiliation, anger, and a deep sadness that even his distinguished career could not shield him from such treatment. Reaching his sedan, Marcus discovered his belongings scattered across the seats from Reynolds's illegal search. The family photo he kept in the glove compartment, showing him in full Secret Service attire standing behind President Obama, lay face up on the passenger seat. That should have been his first clue, Marcus thought bitterly as he carefully organized his items. Sergeant Ramirez approached his window. "Mr. Johnson, I want to personally apologize again. This isn't how our department operates." "Isn't it?" Marcus asked quietly, because Officer Reynolds seemed very comfortable with his actions. "This isn't about one bad officer, Sergeant. It's about a system that allows officers like him to act with impunity." Ramirez nodded solemnly. "I understand. And I promise you, this incident won't be swept under the rug." As Marcus finally drove away, he noticed Reynolds watching him from the patrol car, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. In his rearview mirror, Marcus could still see neighbors standing in the street, phones raised. By morning, he knew the video would be everywhere. His private life would become public, his dignity compromised. But perhaps, he thought, something good could come from this humiliation. Perhaps this was an opportunity to create real change. Marcus arrived at the Pine Ridge police station at exactly 9:00 a.m. the next morning. He wore a crisp Maybe suit, the same style he had worn during his years of service. It was not vanity that prompted this choice, but strategy. He understood the power of perception. The front desk officer looked up as Marcus entered, recognition immediately crossing his face. "Mr. Johnson," he said, standing quickly, "Captain Williams is expecting you." Word traveled fast in small departments. Marcus nodded politely and followed the officer through the security door into the station's interior. Several officers stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, a few openly hostile. The officer led Marcus to a conference room rather than an interview room, another sign that this case was being handled differently. Inside waited an older man with salt and pepper hair and captain's bars on his uniform. "Mr. Johnson," Captain Williams said, extending his hand. "I'm deeply sorry about what happened yesterday. Please, have a seat." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for seeing me promptly, Captain. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Lieutenant Michael Foster," Williams said, gesturing to a man in plain clothes sitting quietly in the corner. "He handles our internal affairs investigations." Marcus nodded to Foster, then froze. Recognition dawned on both men simultaneously. "Marcus?" Foster said, rising from his chair. "Marcus Johnson." "Mike." Marcus replied, a genuine smile breaking through his serious expression. "I had no idea you were with Pine Ridge PD now." The two men embraced briefly, leaving Captain Williams looking confused. "We worked together on Presidential Security Detail in Chicago, 2019, Foster explained to his superior. Marcus was the deputy special agent in charge. He literally wrote our joint operation playbook. Williams's face registered shock. "You were that high up in the Secret Service?" "I served where I was needed," Marcus replied modestly. "Mike and his team were exceptional partners during that assignment." Foster shook his head. "When I saw the report this morning with your name, I couldn't believe it. I assumed it was a different Marcus Johnson. Then I saw the credentials that were logged into evidence." Speaking of which, Captain Williams interrupted, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Your complete belongings, Mr. Johnson. Everything has been documented and returned. Marcus accepted the envelope and checked its contents. Thank you. Now, Williams continued. I've reviewed Officer Reynolds' body camera footage, as well as several videos submitted by your neighbors. What happened was completely unacceptable. Where is Officer Reynolds today? Marcus asked calmly. He's been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation, Foster answered. To be frank, Marcus, this isn't his first incident involving racial profiling allegations. Marcus nodded slowly. I suspected as much. His behavior seemed practiced, not impulsive. Captain Williams leaned forward. Mr. Johnson, I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. Pine Ridge PD does not tolerate bias policing. With all due respect, Captain, Marcus replied, this isn't just about Officer Reynolds. This is about departmental culture and training. How many other officers wear Confederate flag pins partially hidden behind their badges? Williams's eyebrows shot up. I wasn't aware of that detail. It's visible in the neighbors' videos, Marcus said. I noticed it immediately, as did several of my neighbors who sent me their footage last night. Foster made a note. That alone violates department policy on unauthorized uniform additions. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young officer poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Captain, but the mayor is on line 1. She says it's urgent. Williams sighed. The videos have gone viral, Mr. Johnson. Our department is receiving calls from national media outlets. The mayor is concerned. Marcus had expected this. Captain, I didn't come here seeking publicity or to damage your department. I came because what happened to me happens to people without my connections and resources every day. Foster nodded in agreement. He's right, Captain. We've had 6 complaints in this neighborhood alone over the past year. What do you suggest, Mr. Johnson? Williams asked, looking genuinely interested in his answer. Marcus leaned forward. I have some ideas, but first, I'd like to see your department's current training protocols on community engagement and bias recognition. For the first time since his humiliating arrest, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. Perhaps there was a reason he had retired to this community after all. By noon, the Pine Ridge police station had transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the street outside, reporters clutching microphones stood at the ready, and the department's phone lines hadn't stopped ringing. The video of Marcus's arrest had indeed gone viral, reaching millions of views overnight. Inside the conference room, Marcus sat across from Mayor Patricia Simmons, a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s who had rushed to the station after her call with Captain Williams. Mr. Johnson, she began, on behalf of our entire city, I want to express my deepest apologies for what happened to you. Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He had heard many apologies in the last 18 hours. Thank you, Mayor Simmons. The press is demanding a statement, she continued, glancing nervously at the window where blinds blocked the view of news crews outside. They're calling it another example of systemic racism in policing. The hashtag Justice for Marcus is trending nationally. Captain Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're prepared to announce Officer Reynolds' suspension pending investigation, but that's not enough, Marcus interrupted calmly. Suspending one officer won't address the underlying issues. The room fell silent. Mayor Simmons studied Marcus with newfound interest. What do you suggest, Mr. Johnson? Marcus opened a folder he had brought with him. I've reviewed your department's training protocols on bias recognition and community engagement. They're outdated and insufficient. Lieutenant Foster nodded in agreement. He's right. We haven't updated those materials in nearly 5 years. Furthermore, Marcus continued, there's no meaningful civilian oversight of your department, no body camera audit process, and no regular community feedback mechanisms. Mayor Simmons looked surprised. You determined all this since last night? I've been in law enforcement for 25 years, Mayor, Marcus replied. I know what to look for, and I know what works. Captain Williams leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Johnson? Instead of immediately answering, Marcus pulled out his phone and displayed several text messages. I've received offers from 3 civil rights attorneys since this morning, all eager to file lawsuits against your department and the city. The mayor paled visibly. "Mr. Johnson, surely we can resolve this without litigation." "That's precisely what I'm suggesting," Marcus said, putting his phone away. "I'm not interested in lawsuits or settlements. I'm interested in meaningful change." For the first time since entering the room, Marcus allowed his professional mask to slip slightly, showing the genuine pain beneath. "What happened to me yesterday happens to black citizens across this country every day. The difference is, I have the training, connections, and resources to fight back. Many don't." The room fell silent again as his words sank in. "I propose a comprehensive reform initiative," Marcus continued. "I'll work directly with your department as a consultant to develop new training protocols, establish civilian oversight, and create community engagement programs." Lieutenant Foster nodded enthusiastically. Marcus's expertise would be invaluable. His conflict de-escalation protocols were adopted by multiple federal agencies. Mayor Simmons looked thoughtful. "Instead of a PR nightmare, we could position Pine Ridge as a leader in police reform." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "And I'd be willing to speak at a press conference today, alongside you and Captain Williams, to announce this initiative." "What about Officer Reynolds?" Captain Williams asked cautiously. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "He needs to be held accountable, certainly. But firing him without addressing the environment that fostered his behavior would accomplish nothing." "You're suggesting rehabilitation over punishment?" the mayor asked, surprised. "I'm suggesting both," Marcus clarified. "Accountability and education. Officer Reynolds should face consequences, but also undergo intensive training and community service." Mayor Simmons studied Marcus with new respect. "Mr. Johnson, when I woke up this morning, I expected to face an angry man demanding an officer's badge and a large settlement check. Instead, you're offering solutions." Marcus smiled slightly. "My entire career was about protection and prevention, Mayor. Old habits die hard." Captain Williams extended his hand across the table. "I think we have the beginnings of a partnership here, Mr. Johnson." As they shook hands, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Perhaps his humiliating experience could become a catalyst for real change in Pine Ridge. Outside, the reporters waited eagerly for their story. They would get one, just not the one they expected. The community center buzzed with anticipation as residents filed in, filling nearly every seat in the large meeting room. 3 months had passed since Marcus's wrongful arrest, and Pine Ridge had undergone remarkable changes in that short time. At the front of the room stood a podium flanked by chairs occupied by Mayor Simmons, Captain Williams, Lieutenant Foster, and Marcus himself. In the front row sat Officer Reynolds, no longer in uniform, but in civilian clothes, his expression a mixture of discomfort and resignation. "Good evening, everyone," Mayor Simmons began, addressing the packed room. "Thank you for joining us for this 3-month progress report on the Pine Ridge Police Reform Initiative." Marcus surveyed the crowd, recognizing many faces: Mrs. Wilson and her husband, several other neighbors who had witnessed his arrest, community activists, and nearly 24 officers from the department, some looking interested, others skeptical. "Before we begin," the mayor continued, "I'd like to once again thank Marcus Johnson for turning what could have been a divisive incident into an opportunity for growth and healing in our community." Applause filled the room, causing Marcus to nod humbly in acknowledgement. The journey to this moment had not been easy. Captain Williams stepped up to the podium next. "As many of you know, 3 months ago we began implementing sweeping changes to our department under Mr. Johnson's guidance. Today, we're sharing the first results of those efforts." A screen behind them displayed a series of statistics and charts. Lieutenant Foster stood and pointed to the first graph. "Civilian complaints are down 38% compared to the same period last year," he announced. "Officer-involved confrontations have decreased by 27%, while successful community interventions have increased by 42%. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Marcus rose and approached the podium. Unlike the others, he needed no notes. "When I was wrongfully detained 3 months ago, I had 2 choices: pursue personal retribution or push for systemic change. I chose the latter because I understood something important about policing." He paused, making eye contact with several officers in the crowd. "Effective law enforcement isn't about power, it's about trust. Without community trust, police work becomes nearly impossible. Several officers nodded in agreement, including, surprisingly, Officer Reynolds. In the past 90 days, Marcus continued, every officer in this department has completed our new training program focusing on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. We've established a civilian review board with real oversight powers, and we've launched community policing initiatives in neighborhoods that historically had strained relationships with law enforcement. Mrs. Wilson raised her hand. What about Officer Reynolds? Many of us are still concerned about his presence in the department. All eyes turned to Reynolds, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus nodded to acknowledge the valid question. Officer Reynolds has been a key part of this process. Rather than simply firing him, which would have sent him to another department unchanged, we chose a different approach. Captain Williams took over. Officer Reynolds was suspended without pay for 30 days. During that time, and since his return to limited duty, he has undergone intensive training and completed over 100 hours of community service, primarily in predominantly black neighborhoods. Reynolds stood up, turning to face the crowd. His voice was quiet but clear. I was wrong, not just that day with Mr. Johnson, but in my approach to policing in general. I carried biases I didn't even recognize, and I used my badge as a shield against examining them. The room fell silent, surprised by his candor. Working with Mr. Johnson these past months has been humbling, Reynolds continued. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to be better, to do better. Marcus watched Reynolds closely. The transformation seemed genuine, though only time would truly tell. Change doesn't happen overnight. Marcus addressed the room again. What we're building here is a model that we hope other departments will study and adopt. Pine Ridge is becoming an example of what policing can and should be. As the meeting continued with questions from residents, Marcus reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. His years protecting presidents had prepared him for many things, but not for becoming the catalyst for change in a small suburban police department. Yet somehow, this might be his most important service yet. 1 year to the day after his wrongful arrest, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in the Pine Ridge Police Academy's graduation hall. Before him sat 22 new police cadets in their crisp uniforms, about to take their oath of service. Among the guests in attendance were Mayor Simmons, Captain Williams, Lieutenant Foster, and in the back row, Officer Brian Reynolds. The room fell silent as Marcus began to speak. 1 year ago today, I was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car on my own street, Marcus said, his deep voice filling the hall. I had committed no crime. I was simply driving home after visiting my daughter. Some of the cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the now famous incident that had transformed their department. I could stand here and tell you about my 25 years in the Secret Service, Marcus continued. I could list the presidents I helped protect or the countries I visited on security details, but that's not why I'm here today. Marcus paused, looking at each cadet in turn. I'm here because what happened to me revealed both a problem and an opportunity. A problem of bias in policing that affects communities across our nation, and an opportunity to create meaningful change. In the audience, Officer Reynolds looked down at his hands, the memory of that night still painful. In the past year, Pine Ridge has become a model for police reform, Marcus said with pride evident in his voice. Civilian complaints are down 64%. Community trust ratings have increased by 47%, and officers report higher job satisfaction and lower stress levels. Captain Williams nodded in agreement from his seat beside the podium. The changes have been dramatic and measurable. Today, as you prepare to take your oath, I want to share the most important lesson from my career, Marcus continued. Protection isn't just about keeping people safe from physical harm. It's about protecting their dignity, their rights, and their humanity. Marcus stepped out from behind the podium, standing directly before the cadets. Each of you will face moments where your training conflicts with your instincts or biases. In those moments, remember this: the badge you wear is not a shield that sets you apart from the community. It's a symbol of your commitment to serve that community, all members of it, regardless of their color, background, or address. The cadets sat straighter, many nodding in understanding. The training you've received here is different from what officers received a year ago, Marcus told them. You've learned about implicit bias. You've spent time in the communities you'll serve. You've practiced de escalation techniques that your predecessors never had access to. From the back of the room, Officer Reynolds watched intently. After a year of intensive training, community service, and regular counseling sessions, he had recently been restored to full duty. The journey had been difficult but transformative. Now, I'd like to introduce someone who has an important perspective to share, Marcus said, gesturing toward the back of the room. Officer Brian Reynolds. A murmur ran through the audience as Reynolds made his way to the front. Some knew he was the officer who had arrested Marcus. Others were hearing the name for the first time. Reynolds took his place beside Marcus, visibly nervous but determined. "A year ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career," Reynolds began honestly. "I let bias guide my actions instead of proper procedure and human decency." He turned to face Marcus directly. "I arrested a man who had spent his life protecting others at the highest levels. But more importantly, I violated the rights and dignity of a fellow citizen." Reynolds then addressed the cadets. "The lessons you'll learn from Mr. Johnson's program aren't just about policies or procedures. They're about becoming better officers and better human beings. I'm living proof that change is possible, but it takes humility and hard work." As Reynolds returned to his seat, Marcus stepped forward again. "The path forward isn't always easy," Marcus concluded. "But Pine Ridge is showing that when police and communities work together with transparency and mutual respect, everyone benefits. Today, you join a department that is leading the way in redefining what policing can be." As the cadets rose to take their oath, Marcus watched with quiet satisfaction. His humiliating arrest had become the catalyst for something remarkable, a blueprint for change that was already spreading to departments across the country. Sometimes, he thought, protection work takes unexpected forms.